Have you ever noticed that when you sit on the floor, your back hurts? It's not just you. Many people experience low back pain from sitting on the floor, or when they stand up from sitting, they'll feel tightness and discomfort in their lower back. I'm going to explain why this happens and how you can adjust your sitting habits to fix it. We'll explore techniques to support your spine and why rounding your back when sitting might be causing you pain. And if you practice yoga or sit on the floor and stretch, these techniques can help you too. Let's dive in. In general, to have a healthy back and good posture, we want what's referred to as a neutral spine. Our neutral spine has natural curves in the back so that when we run and jump and do different things, it can take the load of things. Our spine is essentially a series of joints, and in between those joints we have the discs, a gel-like substance to help us with compression. When we go from standing to sitting, we are changing the distribution of the weight essentially between those joints. And so your load will be more when you sit down than it will be when you're standing. And that will increase the compression that is felt in those discs. Now, how you can help to alleviate and keep your spine long in a seated position is by sitting in a way that creates the natural curves of your spine, in particular your lumbar spine. Because when we look at the spine, we can see that the thoracic or mid-spine is attached to our rib cage. So it has a little bit more support than something like our lumbar spine, which isn't attached to any other bone structure. So it requires and needs more stability to get out of that compression we might feel when seated. Now, what tends to happen with people when they sit down is they have weak low back muscles and they tend to tuck the pelvis under. And so you can see when I tuck the pelvis under, my low back is now rounding, my mid back is rounding more, and that kind of juts my chin out. If we couple that with tight hips, you might notice that your knees are quite high when you're sitting on the floor, and that's also creating tighter hip flexors and weak ones as well. So we're going to undo this common tendency to sit on the floor like this and greatly decrease your pain and discomfort. So what we want to try to do in this position is achieve a neutral spine. But how can we do that? Well, it really begins with the pelvis. Right now, when we're seated like this, our pelvis is tucked under in what's called a posterior position. And we're essentially bearing weight on our tailbone, which is not designed to bear weight. But if we can move the pelvis and tilt it forward, we then will rock onto the base of our pelvis on our sit bones. And those are like two big knobby bones that are designed to bear the weight of our torso. Now that's easier said than done because it would require some open hips and a strong back to be able to tilt your pelvis a little bit forward. I also want to note that your spine naturally, in its natural curvature, the pelvis is actually tilted 15 degrees forward, and that is what's giving you that curve in your lumbar spine. So essentially, we want to find a way to help you sit on the floor with your pelvis tilted forward in its natural position for a neutral spine. And the quickest and easiest way to do this is to simply sit up on something. So let's see this in action. So if I take any raised prop like a cushion or a rolled up blanket, I've got a meditation cushion here. I like it because it's nice and high. And I sit back down on it, you'll notice probably immediately that I'm able to move my pelvis forward with ease. And that almost in and of itself corrected my posture here. Now I've got my natural curve in my lumbar spine, my shoulders are now stacked over my hips, and those hip flexors were able to release and lower the knees down. So now from this position, I can sit in a neutral spine. Now, when you begin to sit for a longer period of time, we're working against a very strong force, which is called gravity. And that force is going to begin to do this to our posture. It's going to slowly kind of crumble. And that's natural. You're not a bad person if that happens. But what it means is that we actually need to work a little bit when we're sitting down. We want to engage our core muscles, especially the transverse abdominis that helps to pressurize the spine. We also want to use our erector spinae muscles. These are the muscles that go along the back. They're like 3 big bands of muscles. And their whole function is to lengthen the spine up so that our torso can basically stand upright. If you're sitting on the floor in good posture and a neutral spine and your posture starts to crumble pretty quickly, that's just indicating that those muscles are overstretched and weak. And so you want to strengthen specifically the erector spinae muscles, those muscles whose job is to keep your spine upright and in a healthy neutral position, as well as your core muscles to help neutralize and stabilize the spine in an upright position when seated. So some of the best ways to do this are some of our simple but most foundational core exercises. For instance, locust pose, where you're laying on your belly and you're using those spinal erectae muscles to lift the head, the chest, and the legs. And also our balancing tabletop. You want to be sure to keep that back heel in line with the hip. And it's nice to take some pulses here as we bring the arm and the leg down and lift it back up. That's also going to help to strengthen those back muscles. Now let's look at some of your yoga postures or any stretches that you might be doing on the floor and seeing how we can make them a little bit more comfortable and even increase your flexibility. I like to take a folded blanket and place it at the back of my mat. And as I sit down in just something simple like a staff pose, for instance, remember we want to avoid tucking the pelvis under. So that pelvis will still need to tilt forward and you'll feel that you're on the front of the sit bones, and you can see now how my low back is drawing in. Now, the higher you go, the easier it's going to be to get that forward tilt. So you go as high as you need. And just beginning to sit on the floor here with straight legs with a neutral spine, you'll begin to see it's quite a lot of work to maintain that upright spine. The core muscles really have to work. Now, if we want to add more stretching, like a forward fold or something like that, if your hamstrings are tight and you try to fold in this position, what is going to happen is those hamstrings are going to pull the pelvis under, and you'll have that same issue with the rounded low back and overstretched weak muscles down here. And also this position is actually shortening your hamstrings, the opposite that you want to do. And if you want to understand that more, I have a video called Unlock Your Hamstrings that you can click here to watch and understand that. But for purposes of today, what we want to do is tilt the pelvis forward, and that might mean you have to bend the knees. Now you might be thinking, well, if I'm bending my knees, how are my hamstrings stretching? Yes, I get that, but remember, like this, your hamstrings aren't stretching at all anyway, so let's instead unlock your hamstrings by getting your spine in a neutral position and starting to stretch the glutes and everything as you fold. That will eventually go down into those hamstrings. So when we begin to fold, we're flexing the spine. So we're coming out of a neutral spine, okay? And so you will notice that your mid-back and your upper back starts to round, but you still want to have a length and elongation feeling in that low back versus that tucked under position. So again, this really goes for any of our seated yoga poses. We want to have the pelvis tilting forward. The fold is coming from the hip joint. It's not coming from the waist. We don't want to stretch like this. Okay, remember that's just pulling the pelvis under and doing the opposite of what you want. So just having a look here at all of our kind of seated yoga poses, I would recommend as you're building and working to increase your flexibility, to use a blanket as you begin to stretch. If you take anything away from this video, I hope that it is that when you are seated on the floor, you want to do your best to maintain a neutral spine, and the quickest way to do that is by simply sitting up on a cushion or a prop. I'll see you in the next video.